usual. Gwe, Willie Sitboog, Delawisi Shelley Denny, Eligwe, Unamog Institute of Natural Resources. So good morning, my name is Shelley Denny and I work for the Unamog Institute of Natural Resources. Today I'm going to talk about assessing the governability of the Mi'kmaq Atlantic salmon fishery, the Blamu, in Nova Scotia. In our language that would be Blamuwe Gemkuwe, and that means salmon fishing. This is part of the project I've completed for my dissertation, and I had thought I might only think about looking at the Aboriginal right perspective in salmon, but it wouldn't really be fair to my people because Aboriginal rights and treaty rights are very much connected and we don't see differences between the two. So this research is part of a larger project called FishWorks, and that's how I met Saul, which stands for Fisheries, Western and Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And it strives to examine how different knowledge systems can be harnessed to enhance fisheries governance. It's important to understand that governance does not necessarily imply the role of government or the role of law in government. Governance is the capacity to get things done without necessarily having the legal competence to command that they be done. It is through the interactive processes in which society and the economy are steered towards collectively negotiated objectives. So the purpose of my research was to develop a fisheries governance model for Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish in Nova Scotia. And I used the governability assessment framework as a way to look at the governance to see what works and what doesn't. And the model that I will be presenting today is called Unkugamkwadu, and it means doing treaty. So I'll begin first with the governance issue, followed by theory and methodology. Green button, right? Big green button, okay. Big green button. Where? Big green button. Oh, the big green button. Oh, okay. Good. Okay, cool. There's two green buttons. Oh, actually, too, I forgot to mention, yesterday I shared a story about how my hand in marriage was bartered for 2 salmon. And after seeing those beautiful pictures of the salmon in the last presentation, I'm feeling really special right now. Despite the recognition of the treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood in 1999, referred to as the Marshall Decisions, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has failed to create a path for its implementation. But there are also challenges with administrating the Aboriginal right, according to Canadian law and Indigenous law. And as I spoke to yesterday, there are challenges with the Mi'kmaq side as well. And this is a complex governance issue, given the historical, political, and legal context of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights. Legal pluralism plays an important role as the empowerment of dual legal systems and mutual rights for self-determination, especially in the context of the Constitution Act, especially Section 35 and 52. And this creates challenges for abiding by Canadian law and empowers the Mi'kmaq with the ability to make law. Pre-Confederation treaties did not extinguish Mi'kmaq sovereignty, and the imposition of the Indian Act divided Indigenous nations into First Nations and replaced traditional forms of governance. Interpretations, of course, do limit Aboriginal and treaty rights, but regardless, Mi'kmaq fishers assert their Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish in Nova Scotia. And in some cases, Mi'kmaq assert their treaty right to fish for salmon without agreements or cooperation with the federal government. Big green button, big green button. Okay, got this now. So my research question was how can Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish be governed in Nova Scotia? And it's explored using 3 related questions. First, it was interested to determine an image of the Mi'kmaq fisheries undertaken through Aboriginal and treaty rights. Second, a methodological framework was developed to understand the opportunities and challenges to current governance, using Atlantic salmon as an example of an expression of the Aboriginal right and the American lobster as an example of the treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood. And third, by examining those case studies, limits to current governance were identified to provide insights into the development of the fisheries governance model. So 3 propositions were developed as a theoretical underpinning for the analytical framework. The Western governance seems at odds with the multiplicity of Indigenous knowledge systems. Understanding the challenges and opportunities arising from these different knowledge systems can lead to mutually beneficial outcomes. And implementing self-governing arrangement for the Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish is more likely to be successful using shared values and beliefs and addressing issues of social justice. So as understanding the interplay between knowledge systems is the underlying justification to Fishwick's research, the theoretical framework chosen was that of two-eyed seeing. And this was coined by Elder Albert Marshall in the East Coast. He's Mi'kmaq as well from Eskasoni. And two-eyed seeing refers to the use of the strengths of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems for the benefit of all. And this includes salmon and lobster and all the animals. So knowledge systems ideally are underpinned by beliefs that influence values. And as such, knowledge systems are often at odds because of conflicting values and beliefs. I spoke to this yesterday about how sometimes we just try to change each other's beliefs and we don't quite understand where we're coming from. Thus, the interplay between knowledge systems often results in tensions. And two-eyed seeing recognizes these tensions can lead to a greater understanding of the differences, and the use of shared values and beliefs can bridge knowledge systems. And this framework is underpinned by social justice. So social justice in the broadest sense is about the fair treatment, including the respect for the rights of minorities or those oppressed in society, that results in transformative action. So the theory that I used that contributed as the analytical lens and guide to the design of the governance is interactive governance theory. As a complementary theory to knowledge systems and social justice, interactive governance theory emphasizes the prominence of values underpinning governance, recognizes multiple modes of governance, and also recognizes that need to shift power in order to improve governance. And interactive governance theory conceptualizes governance as being comprised of three interrelated parts. The system being governed comprises both the natural and the social systems, which are comprised of properties impacting its capacity to be governed, or its governability, depending on how diverse, complex, dynamic, or vulnerable the system is. The governing system is comprised of what's called elements and modes and orders, and the elements refer to the intentional components that contribute to governability. And this is based on the image of the fishery, where it needs to be, and the instruments and actions used to get there. And three governing modes are recognized, and each with a particular style of governing interactions. So a hierarchical, as the top-down approach, uses law, policy, and sanctions as governing interactions, and this is currently the federal or state way, Department of Fisheries and Oceans way. And hierarchical is theorized in interactive governance theory as better suited to address vulnerable or fragile ecosystems. And self-governing is the most informal and decentralized mode, with decisions being made by those closest to the problem, and is theorized to be better suited to address diversity. And co-governing refers to arrangements where parties join hands to cooperate, communicate, and coordinate as governing interactions. And co-governing is theorized to be better suited to address complex and dynamic situations where interaction is needed for learning or to address conflict between user groups. And the last component are the orders, and this is where governance is operationalized. The meta-order refers to the overarching principle or principles and values of the governing system, and these are then reflected in the structures and the institutions that determine the constraints and opportunities for governance, referred to as second order. And lastly, the first order refers to the relationship of how people and their institutional structures solve problems as influenced by the meta-order principles and second order institutional structures. And the governing interactions are those processes influencing governance, and they are the key areas where power relations emerge between the governing system and the system to be governed. An interactive governance theory posits that there is a relationship between the mode of the governing system and the properties of the system to be governed and its compatibility to respond to those properties. So I used a case study method, and my method consisted of a design phase, a data collection and analysis phase. So I used semi-structured interviews with 52 participants in two case studies, Atlantic salmon and American lobster. It also consisted of a comparative analytical phase, which allowed for the testing of the consistency of the existing theory and propositions with the cross-case findings and allowed for insights to support the development of the governance model. So we'll now turn to the results. Mi'kmaq participants noted that concepts of fishing and terminology for Aboriginal and treaty rights, while having distinct legal meanings, are interconnected. And many fishers refer to the treaty right as inclusive of the Aboriginal right, as the Treaty of 1752 reinforced the Mi'kmaq free liberty of hunting and fishing as usual. And based on Mi'kmaq values that emerged in the interviews, the image of the Mi'kmaq fisheries is one that supports the individuals and collectives' physical, spiritual, cultural, and economic needs, yet is self-governed, ethical, shared, responsible, conservative, and intermittent. So when I did my interviews, and there was a lot of interviews and a lot of transcripts and a lot of codes, and a lot of time it took to go through them. But there were key things that were uncovered through these interviews. And going through it from a two-right-seeing perspective, I need to separate these. And I did this by creating 3 different groups. So the Mi'kmaq comprise of the Mi'kmaq fishers, the leaders, and those working in Mi'kmaq or Indigenous organizations, and that's shown in blue. The federal and provincial perspective, which was DFO in the province of Nova Scotia, in gray. And the mixed category was those who were Mi'kmaq employed in non-Indigenous organizations and vice versa, and non-Mi'kmaq fishers. So 6 categories of identified challenges emerged from the analysis of the interviews. As shown on the graph on the left, I don't know if you can actually see that. Can you see the writing on the bottom? No way, okay. 6 categories emerged. They are, well, I can't even see them. Conflicting relations, disputing the legitimacy of the governing system, fearing loss of Mi'kmaq identity, identifying governing gaps, marginalizing Mi'kmaq fishers, and operating challenges and gaps. So the Mi'kmaq, while they identified all 6, they emphasized conflicting relations, disputing the legitimacy of the governing system, and marginalizing Mi'kmaq fishers. For the federal and provincial participants, disputing the legitimacy of the governing system and identifying governing gaps were emphasized as the 2 most significant challenges, and not surprising, they didn't see fearing loss of Mi'kmaq identity as a challenge. And the mixed participants generally align more closely with the Mi'kmaq findings, except for identifying governance gaps. But importantly, there were subcategories for challenges for the Mi'kmaq participants. While there were conflicting relations between Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq fishers, as well as between Mi'kmaq and the DFO, internal conflict was also revealed. And these are evident as divisions in political organization and leadership, and lack of coordination and collaboration with the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, which is our traditional socio-traditional governance unit. And while both the Mi'kmaq and DFO provincial participants dispute the legitimacy of each other's governing system, internal disputes were also revealed. Mi'kmaq fishers also disputed the legitimacy of the Mi'kmaq governing system regarding the outcomes of consultations and negotiations with DFO, including license agreements, and including agreements and license conditions, and also between the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and First Nation governments as those who had authority to discuss rights issues with the state. And based on interactive governance theory, these challenges indicate low governability specific to how governance is being operationalized, thus the need to examine the orders of the governing system. And turning to the opportunities, 5 categories emerged as shown in the graph on the right. Addressing governance gaps, enhancing operations, founding governance on the Mi'kmaq knowledge system, using current governance processes, and forging a, in brackets, treaty relationship. So here, founding governance on the Mi'kmaq knowledge system was the most frequently cited opportunity emphasized by the Mi'kmaq, while the federal provincial perspective emphasized using current governing processes. Significantly, all 3 perspectives, led by the mixed participants, recognize the opportunity of improving relationships by forging a treaty relationship, as shown to the bars on the extreme right. Here, the Mi'kmaq want a treaty relationship with Canada and recognize the need to unite for solidarity and to act collectively despite reserve boundaries. So I'll now turn to the third and final results section, reconciling limits to governance. So drawing on those 2 case studies, and this is basically the outcome of the governability assessments, 3 important insights were derived. And governability, again, refers to the capacity to be governed, and this assessment can provide insights into what works and what doesn't in current processes. So first, the properties of the system to be governed indicate that all 3 governing modes are needed, despite the differences in vulnerability of the natural systems, such as the example of Blum or Atlantic salmon, that continues to be in decline. Second, and through a cross-case analysis, governance gaps directly contributed to the challenges. The absence of co-governance contributes to poor relations and lack of cross-cultural exchange, and where self-governance is absent or where it's emerging, it's insufficient and contributes to marginalization, exclusion, and lack of participation of Mi'kmaq fishers in governing interactions and decision-making. And third, vulnerability as issues of conservation to justify infringement of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal treaty rights wasn't found to play a pivotal role in determining the appropriate governing mode. So my research showed that complexity and context play a key role in determining the most appropriate governing mode, and in fact, co-governing rather than hierarchical is more appropriate governing mode for vulnerable species such as salmon, and that self-governing rather than co-governing is more appropriate for non-vulnerable species such as lobster when legal pluralism is present. And using the knowledge shared by the participants and the insights gained from my research, I will now turn to the alternative governance model. So this model focuses on enhancing the performance of the three orders shown on the left, the meta order, the second order, and the first order, to address challenges while incorporating the opportunities identified by the participants. So the model also proposes three different things: to govern Aboriginal and treaty rights together, rather than separate as the Supreme Court of Canada treats them, applies to fishers who have Indian status under the Indian Act, whether they live on or off reserve, and applies to fisheries based on Aboriginal and treaty rights, but excludes fisheries that support the economies of First Nation governments. And first, to address the gaps in governing modes, the self-governing component is the missing link in current governance and is recommended to enhance legitimacy and effectiveness. So I'll now go through each of the modes in order, starting with the second and first orders and with the self-governing Mi'kmaq District Fisher Association. The self-governing association was designed according to Eleanor Ostrom's design principles for collective action. Here, organizing geographically as Mi'kmaq districts, which are our traditional ways of dividing ourselves geographically, allows for the incorporation of traditional Mi'kmaq governance and creates boundaries for fishing and fishers. Also in self-governance, those being governed are those who govern. As such, opportunities as first order governance occurs internally within the self-governing unit rather than in external processes. This structure is better suited as a self-governing component is an association. And in associations, the members are the decision makers. So here, Mi'kmaq fishers, as rights holders, are the decision makers. And this would help remove some of the internal conflicting relations between the Mi'kmaq First Nation governments, and importantly, bring fishers out of the margins. It would also provide opportunities to integrate Mi'kmaq traditional governance into the self-governing unit. And within the self-governing unit, two decisions must be made. Is the species vulnerable? If the answer is yes, as it is in the case for salmon, then co-governing would be recommended. And if no, as in the case for lobster, the members would proceed to the next question. The second question is there conflict or sharing required between fisheries or users of the resource? If the answer is no, then members proceed to develop the elements. If the answer is yes, then the two-eyed seeing interactive forum is recommended to resolve conflict or to learn perspectives. Here, the industry has the opportunity to interact and learn with Mi'kmaq fishers. And this forum can also be used to arrange sharing or to solve disputes with other Mi'kmaq self-governing associations, which is currently absent in today's forum. And Mi'kmaq organizations, shown there on the left of the Fisher Association, can provide legal, technical, and community support to the self-governing association where and when needed. The disciplinary tribunal, external to the self-governing association, would be established to address when rules are broken by its members. In an interactive governance theory, self-governing is done without the control of governments. Thus, for self-governing to occur, it must do so with the agreement of the Mi'kmaq governments, yet outside the control and authority of Mi'kmaq governments. And to animate the self-governing association, the Mi'kmaq First Nations must devolve authority as a delegation of authority to the organization. And this can be accomplished using governance tools such as a memorandum of understanding to work cooperatively, and legal tools such as the Band Council resolutions to transfer authority for fisheries. The self-governing association can then be the license holder under the Aboriginal Communal Fishing License Regulations. And while licenses are contentious and are not actually required under Marshall or the Sparrow decision, this would solve the issue of sale by Mi'kmaq fishers, which is currently prohibited under provincial laws. And the structure does not require a self-government agreement. In Canada, the self-government policies still reinforce the federal authority, especially for fisheries. So I'll now move to the co-governing mode. So So the co-governing arrangement, how am I doing for time? I'm fine, okay. Also absent in current governance is shown here in blue, and co-governing occurs between the self-governing and the hierarchical governing modes. The current governing mode as DFO is shown there in the gray on top. And the suggested co-governing arrangement is the co-management model where equal members of the self-governing and the federal provincial authority are represented with an independent chair. And essential to the co-governing mode is the two-eyed seeing interactive form as first-order governance. The industry, shown in the checkbox on the bottom, is part of the co-governing interactions, in yellow, the two-eyed seeing forum, but not part of the co-governing arrangement. And this space is needed to learn, resolve conflict, and improve transparency between fisheries, which is also absent in current governance. And most decisions made by DFO are sub-delegated to regional authorities, including license conditions and agreements with First Nations. So to animate the co-governing arrangement, DFO can delegate authority to the co-governing arrangement, develop an MOU and agreement with a self-governing association. And for the hierarchical mode as DFO, or the province of Nova Scotia, for the sale of the product, alternative measures such as restorative justice processes are used for fisheries, and these can be linked to the disciplinary tribunal if needed. Law is already in place to animate the model. However, policies require revision. Given the diversity in the context of Indigenous peoples across Canada, regional policies would be more appropriate to address those fisheries, given those differences, and include the recognition of the treaty right. Policies should facilitate self-governing opportunities and the need for co-governing for vulnerable species, and also to address power imbalances, especially removing the issuing of licenses in situations where First Nations consent is not provided. Further, federal and provincial policies should be aligned so they are consistent with the governance of Mi'kmaq rights-based fisheries. So I'll now turn to the meta-order as the final component of the model. Whoops. Where's my meta-order? There we go. So the meta-order, or those values or principles underpinning governance, are recommended to be Nedigalumk, which is the Mi'kmaq concept of sustainability, respect, reciprocity, and sharing. And this is our law. This is Mi'kmaq law, Indigenous law. Nimsit Nogama, which is our Mi'kmaq belief that all things are related and interdependent. Treaty relationships as a recognition of mutual benefit and cooperation, and among Mi'kmaq fishers, solidarity. And lastly, the principle of subsidiarity, which affirms the governing responsibility to the lowest capable level of organization. The Fisher Association, supported by the Mi'kmaq associations, would act as the lowest and capable level of organization. And subsidiarity is a key principle in Canada's Constitution and Canadian federalism, underpinning those division of powers between the federal and provincial bodies. But legislative power is not required. Rather, subsidiarity relies on the consideration of proximity. And given the sharing of powers between Canada and the Mi'kmaq are not yet part of Canadian federalism, the principle of subsidiarity is a current governance concept and mechanism to support the self-governing of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish in Nova Scotia. So my last slide. To conclude, my research has contributed new theoretical knowledge contrary to existing interactive governance theory. And so while hierarchical is a recommended mode to address vulnerability of the natural system to be governed, this research provides evidence that co-governing is more appropriate for vulnerable species such as salmon. Similarly, IGT, interactive governance theory, proposes co-governing to address complexity, while my research finds that self-governing would be more appropriate to address the complex issue of legal pluralism that exists in Canada. And lastly, complexity and context have a more important role as a system to be governed properties than vulnerability. And going back to those three propositions that provide the theoretical underpinning for the analytical framework, the findings from the case study allow for testing of these in terms of the consistency with the results. And so the results comparing the two case studies provide evidence to support the current governing mode is neither legitimate or effective, even when vulnerability of the resource is an issue. And the interplay of knowledge systems provide understanding as to why they conflict and how the role of shared opportunities and common ground to develop a governance model is key to support the Proposition 2. And while there's limited practical evidence to support Proposition 3, as the model is untested, theoretically, self-governing serves as the keystone to the alternative governance model for the Mi'kmaq fisheries, and the use of shared values and beliefs can bridge knowledge systems and lead to a greater understanding of the differences. And this is the theoretical underpinning for the use of two-eyed seeing in the development of the governance model. So, Walalio. Thank you.